In this video, I want to talk to you about the four most common injuries that we see with cycling, what causes them, and most importantly, what you can do about them. So, of the four main areas that we see, one of the common areas that we see are the hips. So, why do our hips hurt when we're cycling? Well, we have our big, most powerful set of muscles termed our glutes, or our glute muscles that wrap around that hip. Now, when we're cycling or doing any endurance activity like running, these are big users of those glute muscles. So what we can typically see in cyclists is that they start to develop some hip pain, and this can really be as a result of that glute tightness. Now, the other thing to understand about these glutes is that they can actually cause problems elsewhere, which is what we're going to talk about as we move through some of these conditions. Because one of the second conditions that we see are issues with cyclists in the lower back. Now, I have this phrase that that your back hurts, but it's your butt's fault. And what I mean by this is these glute muscles that I mentioned that can cause these hip pain can also then cause lower back pain, as these muscles come and they attach into the lower back. So if we're developing pain through these glute areas, yes, they can be causing hip pain, but that can also be radiating up into the lower back. But when it comes to the lower back, we can also throw in another area related to the hip, termed our hip flexors. Now, the hip flexors are the muscles that sit on the front of the hips, and they literally lift our legs. So when we're cycling and going through the revolutions of cycling, we're using those hip flexors a lot. So a lot of cyclists that we see become very tight in those hip flexor muscles or tight in those glute muscles. And when we get these things going on, these can affect us in either the lower back or the hip, as I've mentioned. The third common area that we see issues with cyclists are knee pain, and we can almost have this condition that we call cyclist knee or runner's knee, where we develop a pain on the outside of the knee. Now, the thing to remember about the knee and when we suffer knee injuries is the knee tends to be a dumb joint that lives in the middle of the leg and gets beaten up by other areas. So we've been discussing these hip issues, lower back issues caused by glutes and hip flexors. But again, if we get tightness and issues in and around the hip and dysfunction at the hip, that can radiate down towards the knee. And in the case of cyclist knee, that's exactly what happens, that we have a dysfunction at the hip that travels down to the knee and creates this pain on the outside of the knee. The final most common area that we see issues with cyclists is the upper back or neck area. Now, why does this happen? Well, cycling makes us adopt this slightly unusual pose where we're flexed forwards as we cycle, but as a result, we don't want to be looking at the floor. So as we flex forwards, we then need to be looking up. And what that does is create this unusual posture, which can therefore create a lot of upper back or neck tension. So in summary, the four most common areas that we see issues with are the hip, the lower back, the knee, and the upper back and neck. And we've discussed potentially why these may be the case. But most importantly, what we need to talk about is what you can do about this. Well, when it comes to resolving injury, there's probably two key elements that we need to make sure. We want to make sure that these structures are stretched and strengthened. So we want to make sure that we're flexible enough for the demands of cycling, and we want to make sure that we're strong enough for the demands of cycling. So what I want to do now is just flick through some of the key stretches and strengthening exercises to help with these issues. So firstly, with the hip, we've discussed that the glutes can be a big problem with the hip. So here is me showing you perhaps one of my favourite glute stretches, and this is one that I find really beneficial to do daily, but importantly once you finish a cycle. Then we know that these glute issues can cause problems at the lower back, but as I mentioned, we also have these hip flexors that attach into the lower back that can cause problems at both the lower back and the glute. So the hip flexors are another common area that we need to make sure, particularly as cyclists, that we're stretching. So here I am demonstrating one of my favourite hip flexor stretches. And what we want to be doing with these stretches is making sure that we're holding those for 30 seconds. Now, I mentioned that the third most common area we see issues with cyclists is at the knee. So here we want to be making sure that we're stretching out the areas that directly affect the knee. So we've discussed the importance of stretching the hip, but we also have our quads and our hamstring muscles that cross the knee. So we need to make sure they're stretched. So here I am showing you some of my favourite quad stretches firstly, and a reminder you want to be holding these stretches for 30 seconds, and my favourite hamstring stretch. Now you have 3 different hamstring muscles, so this can be a nice one to if you notice I manipulate the toe position, keeping the toe straight, in and out in order to stretch the whole complex. So I mentioned that on top of stretching the muscles, we need to make sure that we strengthen the muscles. So what I want to do here is talk through some of my favourite strengthening exercises that you can do to make sure that you're strong enough for cycling. Firstly, what we want to be doing is making sure that we're working our hip area as discussed. So with this exercise, what I like to do is stand on something like a step, so you can use the bottom stair at home, take one foot off of the side and slowly lower that leg down towards the floor so that your heel touches, and then you bring that foot up to return your hips to level. Now, although the leg that's off the step is working, the side that is actually on the step is the area that you will feel working. So the leg off the step is moving, the leg that is creating that movement is the one that's on the step, and you should be feeling that around your right glute. We'd recommend about 12 repetitions for this one. Another one of my favourite exercises is to try and work the glutes and hamstring complex, and I call this a single leg glute bridge. Now this exercise is fantastic at working through that whole posterior chain, and what that can be doing is making sure that we're strong through those glutes, through those hamstrings. But one of my favourite things about this exercise is we can look for imbalances. Are you as strong in one side to the other? When you do 12 repetitions, do you fatigue in one side more than the other? Because this can show us that there's an imbalance or a lack of strength, and something that we want to address. My third favourite exercise for all cyclists to be doing is the squat. The squat is one of my favourite compound exercises that simply allows us to work lots of muscle groups. But again, what we're doing here is perhaps targeting the glutes and the quads to make sure that they're strong enough for cycling. A reminder that we're looking to do 12 repetitions. And finally, we want to make sure that we're strong in the upper back. I mentioned that the upper back can be into what we would term a protracted position as we round our shoulders away from the body to hold onto the handlebars. So what we want to do in order to counteract those imbalances is make sure that we're doing exercises where we're pulling backwards to work the retraction muscles. So for this, I call this exercise the T's. Now all we look to do is lie flat on the floor and bring our hands out to make a T shape or crucifix. Then turn the thumbs up and simply lift the arms, and you should be feeling your shoulder blades pulling together and the muscles around those shoulder blades working. So, as a quick summary, they are some of my key exercises and stretches for cyclists. The 4 most common areas we see an issue with in cyclists are the hip, the lower back, the knee and the upper back. In order to fully rehabilitate those, you need to make sure that they have enough flexibility and they're strong enough. So that's my 4 favourite stretches and my 4 favourite strength exercises.